Welcome everybody to today's lecturette. I'm Leslie Jones and today we're going to be continuing our discussion on all things culture. We're going to take a closer look at cultural contexts to begin with and the changing face of understanding culture and its impact and influence on individuals. And we're going to take some time to explore the notion of culture providing a sense of place and culture and identity. And finally, we'll move to looking at some dimensions of cultural life. I want to begin our discussion today by exploring culture and engendering that sense of place. We've already discussed that the need to belong to a group is part of the human experience, and that as groups organise, they establish cultural practices and norms that assist people to feel connected through shared values and beliefs and social norms. These connections assist in the development of aspects of identity, and they assist people to construct the internal narrative of that big question of who am I? Of course, there are many other aspects of identity that are socially constructed to build a comprehensive picture of the person to that person, but the anchoring of identity through cultural connections is an important influence on this ongoing process. And we're going to speak in a few slides in much more detail around the notion of identity formation and the role that culture plays. But we've already also mentioned in earlier lecturettes that culture itself is not fixed. It's not a fixed construct. Culture and the values and beliefs, practices and the social norms and cultural icons that make up culture change over time. However, when we think about culture as forming this place for people, personal connections to cultural contexts are also not fixed. A range of influences, including the lived experiences of individuals and things like growing from childhood into adulthood, can precipitate an individual evaluating and making changes to their cultural connections. So it's not the culture per se that can change, but actually the person's connections to that cultural structures. The drive to find a cultural context that works for the individual highlights the significance of this powerful need to belong to cultural context. This drive to make and sustain cultural connections provides people with a sense of place and belonging for individuals. And your text makes the point that this provides a sense of home or to develop a sense of cultural mentality for individuals within that cultural context. Of course, we also recognise that as individuals grow and their lives are shaped by lived experiences, they may find sustaining previous connections to culture difficult to maintain. In these situations, people will lose their sense of cultural place and belonging to the group. In effect, they can become culturally homeless and actively seek to re-establish new connections that are a better fit to their current context. For example, growing from childhood into adulthood often triggers a person's critical reflection and a reassessment of the connections to the culture within a group or even to their country of origin. As another example of this dislocation that can occur from an individual's drive, moving from a single adult life into parenting can cause cultural disconnections to, say, the teenage or youth culture, where people can feel a significant disconnection to former social practices, former values and beliefs. And another example could be that of the recovering addict who may no longer feel the connections to, for instance, the drug culture, including social practices, values and beliefs that they once held, and actively seek to distance themselves quite significant from that former culture. And I'm quite sure that you can think of many examples of the types of changes that can disrupt an individual's sense of belonging to former groups and cultural contexts. These are often trigger points that drive individuals to seek new connections with cultural contexts that resonate better within their own changing identity and personal values and beliefs. And of course, if we think about culture in this way, we recognise that people are often members of many cultural contexts, as well as the overarching culture that we often think of in terms of nationhood and country. This sense of loss of cultural place is easily highlighted when we look at the lived experience of migrant families. Often when they're describing their feelings of cultural dislocation when they physically move to a new country where there is a different national culture. For some, they remain firmly connected and resonate with the culture of their country of origin, and sometimes for very long numbers of decades. Equally, you'll have heard passionate stories of migrants who have come to Australia, for example, and have adopted the culture of their new home and see themselves as part of the Australian culture entirely. And of course, there are also many migrants who identify with both, who feel that they have a cultural home that incorporates both cultures. And again, this highlights the notion that people can ascribe to multiple cultural contexts at any one given time. So, as we begin to really understand that culture is much more than just the national culture that we often think of in terms of shared holidays and celebrations, etc., we understand that cultural context exists in any shared group of people around a centralised organisation of social structures. When we begin to expand our concept of culture to include this type of dynamic and elements, we can begin to understand that groups of people within a broader culture can also develop separate yet defined cultural contexts. In topic 1, I want to take us back there just for a moment. We spoke about ways in which childhood has become ever more nuanced, with ever more separate developmental and social constructs used to describe and define children. In much the same way, we now see emerging images of groups of people who identify and connect through social norms, values, and beliefs as distinct cultural contexts that individuals identify with and gather around. I'm sure that you can recognise the sorts of cultural contexts for groups of people, such as religious culture, pop culture, the drug culture, gang culture, the retirees or the grey nomad culture, the yuppie culture, or the double income, no kids culture, just to name a few. Many of these cultural contexts are relatively new and are really moving from the far extremes of social life into a more accepted profile of our cultural heritage. When we think of these cultural contexts, we can recognise the differing cultural practices and the traditions, the language that's used in these social contexts, the social norms and the rules, in addition to or alongside of the dominant culture in which they operate. At times, these cultural contexts will be in conflict to the dominant culture, and at times alongside of it, and over time can shape dominant culture. So, for example, the cultural context of the gay and lesbian communities was in direct conflict with dominant conservative cultures in this country for decades and really has only begun to change in very recent decades. However, over time, the acceptance of the individuals and this cultural context has grown and has subsequently shaped the dominant and mainstream cultures in ways that 2 generations ago would have been unheard of. So, as we begin to really consider the nature of cultural contexts, it's timely to take a brief look at the impacts of cultural associations. Being connected to others through a variety of cultural contexts is an essential enabler for the formation of identity. And the study of identity has been researched in multiple domains, including psychology and sociology, over much of the modern era. From an interactionist perspective, identity theory has evolved from the early work of researchers such as Mead and has proposed that society shapes the individual perceptions of self, but in turn, self shapes social behaviours through the production and reproduction of certain identities. Now, that means that the production and reproduction of identities occurs through the millions of social interactions that an individual may have over a lifetime. And the massive social interactions, interaction by interaction, build a picture of the individual's identity for themselves and for others to see. Identity theory asserts that at any given time in the lifespan, people hold multiple identities, choosing to evoke specific identities based on the social and cultural context and or the situation that they are actually facing at a particular time. Research provides a really helpful framework of the contextualisation of identity within 3 broad categories, and they are situational identity, where identity is emergent through direct interactions and meaning making with others. Social identity, where identification by self and others of positions within social structures, such as groups and categories of people. So how do people fit within the group of social interactions that they're having. And personal identity, that is constructed through the unique self-narratives and biographies within a given culture and historical context. So a very internal metric around personal identity. Therefore, for our purposes, cultural context provides an opportunity through the shared connections of people engaged around a central cultural ideology for both situational and social identity formation. So, the shared values of people, the shared language, the shared connections to traditions and practices all help to provide a proving ground of sorts for individuals to help form those aspects of their identity. And the situational and social identity actually also then cascades to help inform that internal narrative of personal identity formation. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the actual process of when a person chooses to move into a new cultural context. And there's this notion around there's a negotiated process that a person has to work through as they move into a new cultural context and embrace a new aspects of what being in that cultural context actually means. And there's some dynamics that are involved. So things like understanding the cultural ideologies, including values and beliefs of the new context that they're working within, and becoming competent in the cultural practices and building an understanding and accepting of these are the way that we do things around here. And also moving along the culturally accepted pathways and observing cultural rules for uniformity that are set down by the broad expectations of how members of the cultural context will actually behave in social and in private areas. So in things like such as work and relationships, when the rites of passage and when adolescence ends and adulthood begins, all of those sorts of milestone things actually map out an accepted way of living within a cultural context. Observing the cultural rules provides a sense of uniformity for the cultural members and includes at the bigger level big rules like for things such as the responsibility of individuals towards the group, parenting responsibilities of children within the group, and things like social taboos. These rules are grounded in the values and beliefs of the cultural ideology, and they can be very explicit. Or, alternatively, they can be very implied or implicitly known by the members. The change into a new cultural context is not always uniform and is somewhat of an organic process. So as individuals move from one cultural context to the new, it's not just as simple as moving out of one and into the new. Rather, it's a transitional process that's negotiated and is involved that the individual, and it's very much an individual journey. Your text provides an example that some people may take on board the language of a new cultural context before they fully connect with the values and beliefs. Or alternatively, individuals may connect with the values and beliefs long before they ever enact any of the new cultural practices. So this highlights that there's no sequenced way around making these sorts of negotiations, nor is there a prioritised way of making this negotiated change from one cultural context to the other, but rather it's this organic process that people find their own way. But no matter which way they do it first, these are the four big areas that people have to become competent in and masterful of to feel connected to a new cultural context. I just wanted to tease out this notion around cultural ideology as part of the dynamics of cultural context because it's so critically important to understanding that it's an enabler for people to feel connected. So as individuals connect with cultural context, they must align to the cultural ideology that is espoused by the members of the cultural group, or they'll never feel embedded within the culture. So cultural ideology involves individuals understanding the ways of thinking about everyday experiences, and the ideology of the culture provides a cultural model or a roadmap of sorts for individuals to review and evaluate the everyday things they encounter against the values and beliefs espoused by the given cultural context. So, for example, an individual who is connected to a religious or faith-based culture will use the cultural model of religion to help guide their actions and behaviours, and these behaviours and actions may be quite different to the behaviours and actions of those not connected to the same cultural context. So, a really easy working example of that is the practice or behaviour of saying grace before meals. So, people that are involved with a religious culture will show their children and engage with a daily practice of saying grace before meals, where people who are not part of that cultural context don't necessarily engage in the same sorts of practices. So, the ideology is just critical in actually informing people's behaviours and actions based on how they align to values and beliefs within the culture. So, closely aligned to the notion around cultural ideology is the development of cultural practices. And cultural practices include the repeatable behaviours that are underpinned by those set of expected and agreed actions that are informed by the values and beliefs. The practices are known and agreed to by compliance and adherence to the practices by the majority of the individuals within the cultural context. For example, the practice of removing shoes before entering a temple or a house is a common and expected cultural practice in many parts of Asia. It has become a routine that everyone just does. Parents model cultural practices to their children and they in turn to their children. They are often reinforced in educational systems and spill into the social settings beyond the family contexts. So, in order for a behaviour or action to be considered a cultural practice, it's really important to understand that it's that whole of group context that makes up a cultural practice. So it's not just one or two or 100 families removing their shoes before they go into a temple or into a house in the last example, but it's everybody does it. And so when everybody does it, it starts to take on this notion of being a cultural practice rather than an individual familial or an individual behaviour and expectation within a small group. And of course, well-known cultural practices are grounded in historical roots. They're often held in place over decades, if not centuries, and some have been held in place since antiquity, especially in Indigenous culture. Lawrence Brooker and Dodds from chapter 5 in your text highlight that cultural practices that have been sustained into contemporary lives are often grounded in historical roots that are lost to the current cultural members. They're often kept alive within cultures through repetition and storytelling over generations, long after the reason for establishing those cultural practices has been lost to time. Cultural practices are significant in highlighting the cultural differences between groups and can highlight people's surprise at thinking that everybody does this when they're part of a group. And when they see the juxtaposition between their practices and others, they can be a bit surprised that there is the sort of differences that we can see when we stand back. The noted differences in cultural practices can also be a source of tension and concern when two cultural groups intersect. New migrants may feel anxious that a routine behaviour or a practice is not accepted in their new home and may even be sanctioned. This tension at the point of intersection can have quite negative implications and lead to things such as racism, discrimination, and social exclusion of families and children, and of course, in the worst case scenarios, can actually lead to physical violence. The cultural ideology, practices, culturally accepted pathways, and rules for uniformity within a cultural context provide a rich understanding of the inner workings of culture and how it shapes both individual and group life. Thank you for joining me today as we've explored cultural contexts. In our next lecturette, we'll be exploring the notion of enculturation and acculturation and the implications of a multicultural society.